Written something to present today, but unfortunately I sent it to the island and asked them to publish it tomorrow. And instead they published it yesterday, which was very nice of them. And I'm glad Asanga approved of what I'd said. But that's one reason perhaps not sticking strictly to my script in case of you read it yesterday. But there's a second factor. When I was writing this, the war had started. And the war has just got more and more horrendous. One of the reasons I liked Asanga's book so much is that, like me, he tends to drop into literary and cultural discourse. Not very deep. Well, he's probably deeper than me. I tend to be superficial on that. But he starts with an account of Cambodia, Angkor Wat, a place that made a massive impression on me when I first saw it 35 years ago. And I think it had the same impact on him. But I want to just start with a line and a phrase and an incident that to me sums up the New World Order, which is in fact the Old World Order. Greatest of novelists, Joseph Conrad, wrote something called The Heart of Darkness. And it ends with a man called Kurtz deep in the African jungle who had gone there with certain ideals to civilize the black Africans. And his legacy is two things. One is a scroll, exterminate the brutes. The second is his dying comment, the horror. That was said in Africa. It is the most stunning indictment of the pretensions of colonialism. And 100 years later, a film was made which paralleled that with the Vietnam War. Some of you may remember the Ride of the Valkyries as the bombers bombed, and the rogue general, played by Marlon Brando, another brilliant performance, Kurt's figure. And if you looked, or if you can remember his face then, you can see it in Donald Trump. An extraordinary face. So negatively expressive. Some of you may have seen the cover of Private Eye recently. It had 4 little vignettes of President Trump. Brilliant. One said, "Why did you start this war?" Said, "So I could stop it." Okay, we'll tell the Nobel Committee. The second is, well, the mission was accomplished, which he said every other day now. And his aide is quickly covering a box full of files from Epstein. And this is the world we've been reduced to. No one knows why anyone is doing what they're doing. But I think if there is a new world order, the world has to thank President Trump because he has finally exploded the myth of Western morality. I'm reminded of Gandhi when asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" He said it would be a very good idea. And there is no morality. But I think there are some further lessons, so let me just read a little bit from this analysis of this very comprehensive book. Asanga talks about the shifting alliances. And they're not really shifting because there are no actual breaks in a context in which the 3 contestants for power woo or threaten similar countries diplomatically, but definitely. The area is now called the Indo-Pacific, a term coined, interesting enough, over 100 years ago by a German who wanted to challenge the Anglo-American hegemony that triumphed after the First World War. The Anglo-American hegemony, which some of you may remember, completely betrayed the Arabs when the Arabs who had fought against the Ottoman Empire were then divided up by the French and the British. But it gained currency more recently following a speech by the hawkish Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was instrumental in developing the Quad: Japan, India, the United States, and Australia. And this marked a radical change in Indian foreign policy, for it had prided itself previously on being non-aligned. And the West saw it as too close to the Soviet Union and then to Russia. But as Asanga reiterates, India's approach is governed now by nervousness about China, which in the last couple of decades has made deep inroads into the Indian Ocean. Long after the concept of Indo-Pacific was developed, China saw this word and thought, all right, let's go for it. And they went for it. So now many states around the Indian Ocean, including in Africa, which connects Africa with Asia, are closely connected economically but also otherwise. Instrumental is the Belt and Road Initiative, which it used to develop infrastructure designed to facilitate its own trade, no doubt about that, but also the trade of the countries it assisted. And Asanga is very clear in his book that the initiative has been of great assistance to the recipient countries and contests the Western claim that it was designed as a death trap. I fully endorse this view. To give you a couple of anecdotes, I recall a British friend in Cambodia telling me how the country had benefited from Chinese support which developed infrastructure. Whereas the West in those days concentrated on what it called capacity building. Some of you may remember that word. And what is capacity building about? Jehan knows all about it. It's about supporting those who shared its views through endless seminars in expensive hotels. A practice with which we are familiar in this country too. And the hotels have done very well out of that. Soon afterwards, and this was as interesting, I met a very articulate taxi driver in Ethiopia who had come home from England, where he had worked for many years, who described the expansion of the road network in Ethiopia, which was moving very quickly. This was 12 years ago. It had been neglected for years until the Chinese turned up. And I remember then a Dutchman at a conference talking about the sinister nature of a plane full of Chinese businessmen landing in Africa. Very worrying. And an African responded in irritation that the West had applauded the plunder of the continent by their own businessmen, and the Africans now knew better and could ensure some benefit to themselves as owners of the commodities the West had long thought their own birthright. Abe could say the contrast with the Chinese approach to the frugality of the Indians, a frugality born of relative poverty. But he appends the general suspicions with which Indian interventions are treated, given previous efforts at domination. And while he's markedly diplomatic in accounts of the different approaches of the three players, Asanga doesn't believe in hurting the feelings of others, something that I do all the time, I'm afraid. And time and again, he notes the effortless ease with which the Chinese have begun to dominate the field. His research has been thorough. And the statistics he cites, my only quarrel with them is for aging eyes, they're very difficult to read. But I managed. He cites the statistics about trade, making clear the Chinese are streets ahead of the others, both in terms of balances as well as absolute terms. And he notes too that whereas the Western discourses of Chinese restrictions on freedom, in Sri Lanka it is the others who are wary of transparency. All those agreements that we are not allowed to see. He notes there is no clarity about the agreements the current government has entered into with the Indians, contrary to what had might been expected from former Marxists, it has not resumed the tilt towards China of earlier left-wing regimes. But he shows there's been no break with China. There's lots of discussion about can submarines come here, can they not, what is the policy, who's allowed to enter, when are they allowed to enter, why are they allowed to enter. And of course, all the time the Americans are waiting with their submarines outside to kill everyone in sight. I mean, that, apart from those children, the torpedoing of the submarine is such a classic example of the horror, the sheer horror, and the different explanations given by the Americans, Mr. Trump and his even more prized clown, Peter Hegseth. I mean, how can the world cope with that? But it has to. This is democracy at play. The choice of the people. Okay? Asanga believes that the groundwork China laid still gives hopes of more economic development than what the other two countries has done. We cannot, after all, forget that the Rajapaksa government first asked India to develop the Hambantota port. And I still recall the Indian High Commissioner at the time, Ashok Kanta, telling me when I said, why didn't you take it up? He wondered whether India had not erred in not taking up the offer. And in a marked example of how individuals affect bilateral relations, I think our former foreign minister will mark the difference between the two high commissioners. I have no doubt that his predecessor, the effusive Alok Prasad, who had wonderful relations with Sri Lanka, would have taken up that offer. It was Rajapaksa hubris that made the cost of the port escalate. For when the rock inside the breakwaters was discovered before the harbour was filled, and Mahinda Rajapaksa was told it would not cost much to get rid of it if it was done immediately, he said, no, I must have my birthday party. The port has to be opened on my birthday. So the port was filled, he had a lovely birthday party, and then the waters had to be drained away for the rock to be dynamited. Not cheap. And unfortunately, planning being left to the great villain of the piece, the younger brother, we had grandiose buildings in the town. I mean, go to Hambantota, you can see those extraordinary buildings, instead of the infrastructure that would have ensured greater economic activity. What the cabinet was doing in approving this, I don't know, but they were all terrified of Basil. Understandably so. And, you know, I'm proud that I left Mahinda Rajapaksa early, but I'm still very fond of him. I think the man was destroyed by relations, as indeed was Gotabaya a bit later, but that's another question. The error was repeated in spades with regard to Mattala. Though it was not in the right place, which was not the case with the Hambantota development, which was in the right place. Nothing was done to take advantage of the location. You know, they found a desert and left it desert. You know, the Romans called it peace and left a desert. Mattala was a desert, is a desert, and shall be a desert. But it's been so easy to institute swift connections with the hill country, the east coast, the wildlife reserves. You can't get anywhere from Mattala without going round and round in circles. So easy. The last section of the book, after its thorough examination of the activities of the three major players, deals with Sri Lanka's domestic political challenges. Records politely but incisively the endless blunders that have brought us lower and lower. I told you he's a polite man, but if you read between the lines, though he highlights the callousness of politicians, he also notes how efforts to appease the West weaken what he describes as co-protections. Though there is much speculation about what exactly brought down Gotabaya Rajapaksa, not his government, for that in essence continued with a different leader. Perhaps the most far-reaching revelation in his book is Gotabaya's conviction that it was the CIA that destroyed him. You know, our politicians are not nuanced. He had said, no, India was very good to me. It was the CIA that killed me. As so often when the hidden hand of the West is identified, the local contributions are ignored. CIA has to work on the blunders of our politicians. So things like Gotabe's absurd energy policy, his fertilizer policy, the ridiculous tax concessions with which his rule began. But that does not mean that there were no other players in the game. And I think Asanga makes that point. Gotabe may have contributed to his own ruin, but he wasn't the only one. His problem is he thinks he didn't do anything wrong. I mean, he did. Ironically, his accusations against the United States occur after startling passage. It's well worth looking at that, in which Asanga declares that the fatigue gripping the nation, the United States, not us, is deeper than weariness. It is a spiritual exhaustion, a slow erosion of belief. Rising prices, policy paralysis, and a fractured foreign policy have left America adrift. Inflation haunts them like a spectre. Are we talking only about America, about Sri Lanka, about India, or England? While the immigrant crisis stirs frustrations in communities already stretched to their limits. This, he claims, explains the re-emergence of Donald Trump. Now, in the midst of the horrors that Trump has perpetrated, this passage suggests that he is desperate to assert himself in denial of the fatigues that will overcome a nation initially built on idealism. And we have to give that to America. It was an idealistic, decent country once. Now in the throes of ruthless cynicism. What will follow, I do not know. But the manner in which India's slavishness to the bullying of Netanyahu and Trump has destroyed the moral stature that India once had, and that India had for many years after independence. Whatever its weaknesses, people looked up to it morally. It suggests that his nuanced but definite adulation of Chinese policy will be a hallmark of the New World Order. Thank you.